I was reading about the DC Comics relaunch called Rebirth and Afterbirth, which is supposed to coincide with the launch of the DC Comics cinematic universe. Um, I looked at this and said it's more of the same. And didn't the DC Comics universe relaunch back in 2011 with the New 52? And since this relaunch of the DC universe as a New 52, there was a quick early spike in DC Comics sales followed by a steady decline, which cost DC Comics 10% of its market share. And now Dan Dido and Jim Lee and Jeff Johns and the people who are in charge of DC Comics think that applying this rebirth approach and relaunching all of their titles will get them new readers. I look at this and I see a vicious cycle. DC Comics, over the last 15, 20 years, has been doing the exact same things and expecting a different result. The rest of the world calls that insanity, but this is business as usual at DC Comics. They believe that relaunching the same titles with different creative teams but the same business approaches is going to get them new readers. The big problem with comic book publishers like DC and Marvel is that they are stuck in a 1990s business model and a 1990s business approach, and the publishing world has changed dramatically in the last 8 years. In 2008, we had a complete collapse of the entire publishing industry. Trade publishing pretty much underwent an incredible change because the power went from publishing houses during that collapse to creators like myself. And instead of, you know, publishers having the power over content and material, with the advent of print on demand publishing, ebooks, and digital publishing, that direction went to creators. But over at DC Comics, they still continue to follow, the archaic business approaches of the 1990s and the obsolete ideas of the 1990s. The days of gimmicks and events in comic books should be pretty much over, especially at a multi billion dollar corporation like DC Comics. But this is the approach that Dan Dido and the editors at DC and the management at DC continue to use. They continue to use gimmicks like your convergence or your shock marketing, where they kill off characters and they use stunts in the hopes of getting attention of readers. And that approach is not going to work these days. If you really want to get the attention of readers, you can't do it through a new number one issue. You really have to have really strong stories and really strong content. That's what's going to get the attention of new readers. Books primarily are sold through word of mouth. And if readers hear of a good story, they tell other people about that story. And that's how you build your audience. That's one of the elements you use to build your audience. The other element you use to build your audience is staying the course. And in the comic book industry, we have a lot of people who want instant results, but publishing works like this. It is a long haul business. Publishing is a marathon. You are not going to get results overnight. Any results you get overnight are going to be superficial and short term. A lot of people in comics who came in the 1990s were looking at those million sales numbers that came from a number one issue and thinking that that was the norm. No, that's not the norm at all. Oftentimes, it takes years for a book to find an audience. I can say this from personal experience. I've had books like those in the ISIS series that it took readers a year or two to find. I've had nonfiction books that it took a reader a year or two to find. In the first month of me launching some titles, they've struggled, and some books never even got read in the first month or so. Some books, it will take a while for readers to discover them, and by the time they discover them, sometimes, in some cases with traditional publishing, in places like your Harlequin, that book is out of print. But sometimes, if they're lucky, the rights haven't gone away, so they can get that book back in print. But it sometimes takes a year or 2 years or 3 years for a book to find an audience. And in that time, a publisher has to be patient. They have to make efforts to get the word out, and they have to, supplement the word of mouth that's going out there to get this book help this book build its momentum. And that's something that a publisher has to do by doing things like putting ads in some of the top tier books um, to get the word out about mid card books. It's a process, and it takes time. But and a lot of people in the comic industry, because the industry has been in a slump for 20 years, people at DC Comics are desperate, and they're just throwing crap at a wall and doing all sorts of stuff in a desperate effort to get readers to come back, not understanding again, this is a long haul business, and it's going to take time for readers to discover things. Books are some of the hardest items to sell in the marketplace, out of all the items in the marketplace. And that's because books take time for readers to read, and that takes time for readers to discover. So, again, a publisher has to have patience when it comes down to launching products. And they also have to be very careful about launching products. One of the big problems I saw at DC back in 2011 was they launched too many titles and they rushed too much stuff out. And again, a publisher has to roll stuff out very slowly. When I started the SJS Direct imprint in 2009, I started with one book, and that was the All About Maryland book. And after that, I followed that up with the fantasy title, The Temptation of John Haynes, and All About Nikki. And in 2012, I started the ISIS series. And I had to be very careful as I rolled things out, because when I wanted to launch the ISIS series, I wanted to make sure that all the stories that I did that were brand new for the ISIS series um, fit within the continuity I established in not only the first ISIS that I published with the POD company back in 2002, but with the Temptation of John Haynes I launched in 2011. And since then, I have been, painstakingly careful in launching each book and making sure everything, fits within in the continuity. All the stories are entry points that readers can easily access from the first book to the last, and it's a slow process. And some books do better than others, and some books, struggle. And in the case of the ones that struggle, the other ones are able to pick up and be entry points for the reader there. And sometimes when I do that, the readers pick up, the more recent book, and then they go back, or some people pick up the first book and go forward. But with DC, I'm seeing they launched just too many titles, and that made it hard for a new reader to navigate things. When you roll things out slowly, it allows the reader to be able to read at their own pace and their own level. Another thing that I noticed, that they made a mistake on was trying to force, entry points on people with so-called major storylines. A story should just be a story, and every story should be an entry point. When you make stories easy to access, the reader will just pick up and go with whatever they want to go with. I've had people come into the ISIS series with books that are in the middle of the series, like All About the Goddess and the Beauty Myth, and I've had people come in from the first ISIS. I've had people come in from the Temptation of John Haynes. When you have a universe, people pick their own entry point, and I'm not seeing that with DC Comics. I see people, at DC trying to force the reader to pick up entry point, but a reader should be able to just pick up a character that they like, pick up a story they like, and start reading. And that's why I structure my work to be. I want it to be where a new reader can just come in and say, well, this is the ISIS book I saw and I read. I like it, so I'm going to see what other books are there. But I look at all this relaunching, and it's just really confusing, especially for a new reader to get in, because it just shows the reader, they want to come in, they want to buy their favorite character, And when they come in and they see, Batman, and then they go to the back issues after they've bought the most recent one, they start to get confused. They go, "What do you mean? There's a volume one or a volume two?" A new reader's not going to go through all of that. They're not going to go through that hassle. What they're going to do is they're just going to walk away, and you have to make things very easy and very accessible. And that's why old school publishers, just kept publishing the volumes. And if they had a bad story or a bad storyline, they just, charged it to the game and kept it moving. Because I've read my fair share of, bad comics, and I looked at what something, you know, that many of these comic editors and writers would say. They would say, look, if it's a bad story or the story, is something that the readers don't like, we're just gonna, put a period at the end and never reference that ever again. We're just gonna look at that story, leave that story, there, and then pick up and move on. But a lot of people who came into comics in the '90s, in the creative standpoint, they really didn't understand how publishing worked. They didn't understand, the mechanics and the structure. And this is why I'm seeing all these technical problems and this constant need to relaunch. When you make a mistake, you have to learn how to bounce back from that mistake in writing. And you have to learn how to, put that period at the end of that bad story and then move on to the next story. And that was something, I learned with quite a few stories where, the audience didn't really like it. So I said, okay, if the audience doesn't like that story, well, I'm not going to go in that direction. And I'll just go in a different direction and I'll move on. But I'm not going to, cancel everything, relaunch everything, and then try to get them back. I'm just going to, go in another direction. This story isn't working. We're going to go do another story. And sometimes when I do another story, what happens is the readers come back. Um, and this is something that, a seasoned publishing person would understand. And I look at the people at DC and they don't see seasoned publishing people. Yes, they've been here for a long time, but they just don't understand the business of publishing. The guy running things, Dan Dido, he had no publishing experience whatsoever. And Jim Lee pretty much ran Wildstorm into the ground because he's still coming at comics from a 1990s approach and not understanding that the publishing marketplace has really changed over the last 7, 8 years. And there's a completely different business model being used these days. And nobody really cares about the number one issue anymore. I mean, when there have been 4 or 5 number one issues, the number one has no more value. And when there have been 4 or 5 number one issues, the audience becomes apathetic to numbers. What they really want to see are good stories. What they want are memorable stories. You see, it's memorable stories that gave that number one a value. When a reader goes all the way back through all the memorable stories because they want to go all the way back through the history of the character, that number one has a value. But that number one has no more value because the audience has become indifferent to it. The audience pretty much expects, this series to get canceled and restarted again within 36 to 48 months. And they expect, that to happen. They've become pretty much indifferent to it. They've pretty much become numb to it. And what they've also become numb to is, these books going into decline because, yeah, the first couple of issues are great because the creative team has just started. They have a lot of passion. And what really makes a creative team great is them, keeping that stride all throughout the run. And and you can pretty much lose your passion for a character over 36 to 60 months. I mean, I know what that is because sometimes there are times when I get tired of writing ISIS stories, so I go write an East Team story, or I'll go write something else like a nonfiction, and then when my passion comes back for that character, I can approach them with the same inspiration and vigor that they would before and produce a very inspired story. But there's nobody really in editorial to try to talk to a lot of writers and motivate them so they can understand that, yeah, people do get tired, and it's better for me to put this character aside for a minute, or go out for a walk, and then try to approach them with a little bit more freshness. But when I look at your DC Comics, again, I see them doing the exact same things and expecting a different result. And I look at a business that really does not understand people at the top who don't understand the publishing business, because you can't keep relaunching the same books over and over again in the desperate hope of getting new readers to come in. If new readers keep seeing, these books being relaunched again and again and started over again and again, they're going to get frustrated, they're going to get confused, and they're not going to understand, where to start. And if you have 4 or 5 volumes, and especially going back issues, it becomes downright confusing. And this is all comes, from people not understanding the process of publishing, the process of serialized storytelling, and an understanding of how serialized storytelling works. Yeah, there are going to be bad issues. There may be even bad runs, but a seasoned creator is not going to cancel a series and start over. What they're going to do is they're going to try to regroup, come up with a new strategy, come up with some new approaches, maybe even change the creative team here or there, make some adjustments to the marketing team, and set forth a course that corrects a course that's not working. And I don't see that type of strategizing going on at your DC Comics. I just see relaunch after relaunch, reboot after reboot, and some fanboys may get upset when I say that there's no real difference between a relaunch and a reboot. They're pretty much the same thing from a business perspective. You're just starting over, and you're just admitting that you're making a mistake somewhere. Because in publishing, that's how it is. You're just saying, "Hey, I made a mistake," and if you keep making mistakes over and over again, then it's clear that people don't understand the business, and they don't understand the craft regarding the business. Good publishers know that when you reboot it, you are really it's saying that you're a failure and that you have to start everything over for everybody to understand things. But when you start over, you are putting yourself at a big risk, and when you do this over and over again, you risk alienating your customers. And when I look at DC and how they have alienated their customers, you know, they've not only lost 10% market share, they've lost merchandising. I've started indifference from customers. Whenever I go to a DC board, I hear nothing but arguing. And when I go to other boards for indie comics or I go to boards for Marvel comics, I see nothing but enthusiasm. And this is what you really want. You want people to be enthusiastic about your product. You want them to be excited for your product. You want them to be happy for your product. When people are arguing, that's a bad sign. That's a sign that you're gonna be you're splitting your audience. And in business, they call splitting your audience when half of the people stay home and half of the people come out. And you don't want that. You really want your audience united. When your audience is united, um, it means that everybody is coming out, and you're gonna pretty much make all the money you're supposed to make, and then make money from the casuals as well. Because when people are excited about something, they're willing to tell their friends, and again, it's going to build that word of mouth. But when I look at DC, again, I see the same business approaches being used that didn't work in the 1990s, aren't going to work today, because the publishing world is a completely different place. And in the post 2008 publishing world, you know, you really have to use a whole different approach to reaching people. And that approach, requires a lot of patience, a lot of discipline, and you can't shock people into things. You're going to need to have those really compelling stories to get readers to start buying your books. If your books aren't strong, the reader is not going to come in. They're not going to give you that word of mouth. What they're going to do is they're going to just ignore you, or they're going to start saying bad things about you. And from what I've heard from DC, with all the arguing and going back and forth, I'm not seeing that positive energy that a publisher needs, to restore a brand that has been damaged like the DC Comics brand it has been. And they really need, a good, strong manager to rebuild this brand, because this brand, I believe, can be saved, and I believe it does need a new direction. But the approaches that are being used by DC Comics editorial just aren't going to work, because you can't keep, you know, relaunching stuff without a long-term strategy. Again, because publishing is a long haul business, and you have to have a long-term strategy whenever you go and publish books, comic books. Whenever you're doing any sort of magazines, any sort of publication, you have to have a long haul plan, and that means you have to sit there for 5 to 7 years, even as this book has a hard time, reaching an audience, to make the efforts to try to reach that audience. And your creative people have to understand, that they have to be ready for a long haul. That you're going to have to go to those Barnes and Nobles or those comic shops, and you're going to have to introduce yourself to people so that they can get to know you just like they know your characters, and see what's great about you just like what's great about your characters. And you have to get them excited for you just like you get that they're excited for your characters. And it's part of selling, because the author has to go out there, and the artists have to go out there and really sell not only their characters but themselves, if they hope to, build that audience and get those new readers out there, and make things in a way that's accessible to them, and make things relatable to them. I look at DC Comics, and again, they really need a new business direction, new business model, and they need to be getting ready to adapt, to the changing world of publishing. I don't see that happening right now, because, you know, more new #1 issues don't change a poor quality product. And, you have to have the right type of product and the right business plan in hopes of getting those new readers to get to know these iconic characters and see what's great about them. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up many of the SJS Direct titles on Amazon.com. They come in paperback and ebook. Books like the ISIS series are great reading for tweens and teens. Books like The Temptation of John Haynes are great for teens and young adults. So there's a great host of African American fantasy fiction on SJS Direct. I have some new titles getting ready to come out this year, and it's a whole new group of ISIS series books and John Haynes books coming out, and they are easy accessible. Every story is an entry point. Every story is meant to be accessible to readers of all ages, and every story is meant to be fun reading for readers of all ages. Again, that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.